Hello, class. So I got a question from a student uh, on D2L asking, "Hello, Mr. Madrid. I just had a question about self-conceit. From my understanding, it goes against morality, but I'm still hazy on the topic, even after reading it a couple of times. If I could get a solid answer about self-conceit and its relationship with morality, I would appreciate it. Thank you for your time." Yeah, so thanks for the question. So we are uh, then referring to Melissa McBay Merritt's essay here, right, on the moral source of the Kantian sublime. So first, let's go ahead and scroll down through the essay to answer this question. So this isn't going to answer all the question as far as the main question on the prompt having to do with the connection between morality and the sublime. All we're answering is the student's question about self-conceit and morality. What's the connection there? Okay, so let's be careful to note that. So we're not going to go into exactly what the sublime is here, but I'm just going to try to answer this question. So first thing we need to know is the difference between the sensible and the supersensible here on page 41. Melissa McMay Merritt goes over that in depth. And an easy way to characterize what it is that she's pointing out about Kant's philosophy here is that the sensible can be thought of as what's deterministic, okay, or determinism, and then the supersensible can be thought of as free will, okay. So in other words, freedom is a supersensible way in which we understand morality, and the sensible then is having to do with just what is deterministic. And so when we're talking about what's deterministic in philosophy, we're thinking about the sciences like math, and then likewise laws of physics, etc., and also the theoretical versus the practical. Okay, so then you have the sensible is understood by sense experience. This could also be thought of as empirical too. So empiricism versus transcendentalism, or versus rational um, understanding of things. So these two words have a lot of meaning. So there's free will and determinism, and then likewise the difference between freedom and sensibility and rational cognition. And then there's also the difference between how it is that we're understanding the theoretical and the practical. Okay, so in other words, for Kant, these two things are not the same, and we could easily get these two things confused as well. So in other words, there's a way to consider morality that goes beyond the sensible into the supersensible, and that's where we're regarding freedom. So freedom is supersensible because it cannot be fully contained in the sensible. Remember, we were pointing out that freedom is something that cannot be fully determined. Otherwise, it wouldn't be freedom. In other words, freedom by definition is something that cannot be fully determined. Okay, so therefore, it cannot be fully sensible. It cannot be fully constrained by the laws of science and physics, etc. Okay, so it goes beyond those things. So that's one thing to keep in mind right there to start answering our question. And so McBay Merritt goes into detail on how that's working right here. And so I recommend that you read this section on how those are different. Then at the very end of this section, she points this out. For the purposes of this chapter, it is necessary to grant Kant's not uncontroversial epistemological, and we'll say his ethical claim, that the moral law or categorical imperative is the source of all knowledge about the good to be brought about through action. So let's just break that apart really quick. That's really straightforward. In other words, what she's pointing out right there is that the way to know what goodness is, in other words, we have a direction of goodness that we are thinking of as important in our moral life. In other words, we have a goal toward the unconditional goodness. When we have a goal of unconditional goodness, the way to understand then what is good is to ask ourselves if the categorical imperative can be applied to it. Okay. So in other words, if we are thinking of self-conceit, which is self-love or maybe even arrogance, and we ask ourselves, can the notion of self-love or self-conceit or arrogance be something that could be a universal law? In other words, once we ask ourselves if it could be applied to the categorical imperative here, and we're thinking of the first version, in other words, act as if your goal should be universal law. Act as if whatever you do could be a universal law, more or less. If the answer is yes, it could be a universal law, then it's good. Okay. So in other words, let's ask ourselves if can self-conceit be a universal law? Can self-love be a universal law? Can arrogance be a universal law? We're inclined to say the answer is no, because we need some form of altruism. We need forms of altruism in order for people to take care of each other, because if everyone was conceited or arrogant, having just self-love in their lives, then it couldn't be entirely good, because we need people to help each other, right? That in other words, we cannot think that pure self-conceit would be good at a universal level. No, no, no. Okay? And so what that's doing is it's showing us a couple of things. So if we think back to our points on the sensible and the supersensible, let's go ahead and think about that. That in other words, freedom, if it is supersensible, cannot be constrained with the sensible. That means that the sensible in this case is self-love. In other words, one of the things that she explains when we go all the way to page 44, in her section on moral feeling, she explains this, okay? That in other words, we have this vocation of the mind that, in other words, the vocation that we have is by way of having a moral law that enables the agent to see beyond their own sensible characteristics. So in other words, what is sensible is the idea of self-love. In other words, that has to do with our senses. But to get us beyond that, we have to have the freedom to recognize the categorical imperative enough to see that that takes us beyond the sensible into this vocation, right? So, in other words, the vocation that we have is taking us beyond just our animal selves. So our animal selves are represented by the sensible there, and our rational sense of freedom is the supersensible. Okay, so in other words, the vocation that we have when we recognize that self-love is something we need to move beyond, that's a bit of the connection to the sublime, right? So now one of the things that she points out here too is that our moral law has a conscientiousness that strikes down self-conceit. In other words, self-conceit is not something that's good. And it's because we have this humiliation before people who are exemplary moral agents. In other words, when we see goodness enacted, we might be humiliated, right? But what she points out is that humiliation is just one way to understand that. What we really should be doing is we're getting to something that is establishing a sense of wonder toward the majesty of the moral law. Okay, so in other words, this idea of my spirit bowing is the recognition of something that has an aspect of aversion, but is pointing out something more where you're trying to establish a feeling of respect for the moral law. So in other words, it's not just something that's there to make you feel bad, it's there to bring about respect. In other words, our morality is aimed toward a feeling of respect to something that we have that's greater than ourselves. In other words, what's greater than ourselves is that ultimate goodness that's brought about by letting go of the animalistic, the animalistic sensual nature of self-love. Okay, so in other words, the vocation that we have has to do with getting us out of um, humiliation and into a place of respect. And it's a respect for something that is beyond just our self-conceit. Okay, so here she's referencing the majesty of the moral law. So in other words, the vocation, as I've been pointing out, is getting us to recognize our moral duty that is beyond that supersensual animalistic self-love into something that looks more like it's akin to the sublime. In other words, with the sublime, we have the feeling of aversion, and that feeling of aversion and fear also is something that we have when we're humiliated by an action that is better than what we are at the time. And so what we're doing is we're wanting to move beyond our own selfishness to get to, and also move beyond our own humiliation to get to recognizing the majesty, the greatness of goodness that exceeds our animalistic, sensual self. Okay, so that's probably the best way I could explain this, and I'm hoping that that answers your question. All right, so thanks to the student for asking that question, and have a good one. Bye-bye.